I came to the bank to sign the papers. Everything had already been decided. The house was going to them. I put on a clean shirt, took my glasses, and got ready to sign. But just before my pen touched the paper, the banker, without lifting his eyes, whispered, "Check page 3. His voice was so quiet I barely heard it. I turned the pages, and there it was, the line I had added myself a month ago. My daughter-in-law went pale and began to tremble. That was the moment I knew. Everything was about to change. If this story resonated with your soul, click subscribe and let me know in the comments which city or country you're listening from. I'm truly curious to know where you're tuning in from. My name was William Richards. I was 76 years old, retired for nearly a decade, and for 42 years before that, I'd repaired medical imaging equipment across hospitals and clinics in Arkansas and northern Louisiana. I was never a man of high drama or loud words. I liked machines because they followed rules. When something broke, you found the problem, fixed it, and it either worked or it didn't. There was no politics, no guessing, just precision. That morning, I woke up before the sun, as I always did. My body no longer asked for permission to rise. It simply followed its own rhythm, one shaped by years of early service calls and backroom calibrations. I sat on the edge of my bed and let my eyes adjust to the gray. The ceiling fan above me turned slowly, making that gentle clicking sound it had made for the last 5 summers. I never fixed it. Some things I'd learned just needed to be left alone. I reached for my wristwatch on the nightstand. It was a silver Timex with a cracked crystal. The leather strap softened from years of wear. Eleanor had given it to me for our 25th anniversary, and though the crack made the light catch oddly across its face, it still kept perfect time. It said 6:03. I slipped it on. I took my time in the bathroom. Shaving had become a ritual again. In the early days after Eleanor died, I let the beard grow in patches, uneven and wild. Now I shaved every other morning, carefully, precisely, like she'd once liked. I used warm water, lathered the soap with a badger brush, and dragged the old safety razor across my face in slow, deliberate strokes. The blade was dull, and I nicked my chin slightly, a pinpoint of red surfacing like a quiet protest. I dabbed it with tissue and pressed until the bleeding stopped. In the kitchen, the coffee pot gurgled in its familiar rhythm. The smell of dark roast filled the house, blending with the dusty scent of books and worn upholstery. I made one piece of toast, dry, and sat at the small table by the window. Outside, the sycamore in the front yard had started to turn. Leaves scattered across the lawn like forgotten notes. I was scheduled to be at the bank by 10:12 a.m. The papers were ready. My daughter-in-law, Monica, had said it would be a smooth process, just signatures and congratulations. "We'll handle everything," she had said with that polished smile of hers, the kind that never quite reached the eyes. My son, Daniel, hadn't said much. He rarely did these days. The distance between us had grown not out of malice, but out of years. Years of letting small misunderstandings calcify into silence. I had ironed my shirt the night before. A pale blue button-down Eleanor had liked on me. Said it made me look trustworthy. I hadn't worn it in months. It smelled faintly of cedar from the closet and a trace of the detergent I still used because it reminded me of her. The buttons were slightly loose, but I fastened each one with care. I chose a navy blazer with frayed cuffs and a pair of khaki slacks. Not to impress, just to feel like I hadn't been pushed aside yet. I polished my shoes by the door. Black leather, worn thin at the heels but still holding together. I used the same brush I'd had since 1985, its bristles flattened in the center from decades of pressure. I worked the polish into the creases, buffed it out with an old sock, and slipped the shoes on without a word. Before I left the house, I paused at the mantel. There, in a small silver frame, was the last photo we took together. Eleanor and me, seated on the back porch, iced tea in hand, her hand resting lightly on my knee. Her smile in that picture was soft, tired, but full. The light had hit her hair just right. It looked like a halo. I touched the edge of the frame and let my fingers linger. Then I grabbed my glasses from the entry table, the reading pair with the scratched lenses, and slid them into the breast pocket of my blazer. The drive to the bank took 11 minutes. I timed it every time. Habit. Traffic was light. The roads were clean, freshly painted, the kind of thing Monica would have mentioned in passing. It's good for property values, if we'd still been on speaking terms. I parked near the side entrance, where the lot was quieter. The bank was a square brick building with green-tinted windows and a fake columned facade meant to make you trust it. Inside, the lobby smelled like copier toner and synthetic air freshener. A bowl of complimentary peppermints sat on the front desk, half empty. I took one, out of reflex. They greeted me like I was just another client. Smiles, nods, polite gestures. Monica was already there, seated in the conference room, her phone in hand, her blazer perfectly creased. She looked up, offered a tight smile, and gestured toward the seat beside her. The papers were stacked neatly in a leather folder. The bank officer, a young man named Caleb, sat across from me. Clean-shaven, sharp haircut, dark tie, nervous hands, the kind of man who smiled too much at nothing at all. He walked me through the summary quickly, flipping pages as he spoke. Legalese, property transfer clauses, notary seals. I listened, but I already knew what most of it said. I had read a draft 2 weeks earlier, alone in the kitchen with a cup of tea growing cold. Then he slid the folder toward me and handed me a pen. It was heavy. One of those pens they don't let you keep, meant to feel important in your hand. Monica leaned slightly closer, eyes expectant, like a cat watching a curtain move. I adjusted my glasses and looked down at the first page. Then I heard Caleb's voice, low, almost imperceptible. Check page 3. His eyes didn't move from the paper. His lips barely moved at all. But I heard him. Clear as a bell. I held the pen loosely between my fingers as if it belonged to someone else. Its weight pressed into the center of my palm, cold and unfamiliar, like a decision I wasn't ready to make. The surface of the table beneath my hand was polished to a high shine, and I could see the faint blur of my reflection in it. Older, smaller than I remembered, and surrounded by people who were smiling too much. The room was sterile in that modern bank way. Walls too white, chairs too clean, carpet too gray. Everything was designed to feel professional and impersonal. There was a faint scent of citrus cleaner in the air, like they'd wiped everything down an hour before. The ceiling light buzzed softly above, just enough to make you feel unsettled if you listened long enough. Caleb, the banker, sat across from me, flipping through the pages with a precision I recognized. The way his fingers moved, deliberate, careful, reminded me of the way I used to handle fragile circuit boards, always grounded, always alert. He spoke in rehearsed rhythms, his voice soft, tone smooth like it had been sanded down to avoid conflict. Monica sat to my right, legs crossed, tapping her fingernail against the edge of the armrest in a rhythm that had no music. She didn't look at me often, only when she thought I wasn't looking. Her eyes darted toward the documents, then to the pen, then back to her phone, where a faint vibration buzzed now and then. She didn't check the messages. That told me they weren't urgent, or rather, that nothing happening in this room was more urgent to her than how it appeared. I was supposed to sign my name 4 times, once on the declaration page, once on the deed transfer, once on the acknowledgement of voluntary action, and once on page 3. That was when it happened. Caleb's eyes didn't lift from the document. He didn't shift in his seat, but in a voice so quiet it nearly vanished under the hum of the overhead light, he said, "Check page 3. The words didn't echo. They didn't even linger. They sank, like a stone dropped in a still pond. I looked up at him, but his expression didn't change. His hands remained folded over the next page, waiting for me to flip to it. Monica shifted slightly beside me, the chair creaking under her as she crossed and uncrossed her legs. She didn't seem to have heard, or if she had, she didn't register it. My hand moved to the corner of the packet. I flipped slowly. Page 3. It was almost identical to the draft I had reviewed 2 weeks earlier. Language dense with legal terminology, formatted in a way that seemed designed to discourage attention. But near the bottom, under a section titled Additional Provisions, was a clause I had asked about during my last meeting with the notary. A clause I had quietly insisted be included. I remembered that conversation. I had been sitting alone at the very same table, a week before anyone else knew I was even considering the transfer. The room had been brighter then, sunlight filtering through the vertical blinds, cutting long shadows across the tile floor. I had looked the notary in the eye and said, "Add a clause that protects me in the event of pressure or manipulation." I had used those exact words. "I want a way out if this feels wrong later." She had nodded, and I had watched her type. Now, here it was, paragraph 734. It stated, in careful, quiet language, that in the event the grantor, me, felt the transfer had been undertaken under coercion, misrepresentation, or psychological pressure, the deed could be nullified within a 90-day period at my discretion. No challenge, no counterclaim, just a signature and a letter filed with the court. I ran my finger under the line. The ink was clean. The initials were mine. Monica must not have noticed it during her review, or maybe she'd assumed I wouldn't remember, that I'd been too tired, too distracted, too old. Maybe she thought I would skim, nod, and comply. People see gray hair and quiet manners and start to subtract your agency in small, invisible ways. I glanced at her. She was still smiling. A performance. She leaned slightly toward me and said something about how lucky they were to have this settled, how the kids would grow up with space, how Daniel had always dreamed of a bigger yard. I nodded, but my hand never moved toward the signature line. Instead, I placed the pen down. Caleb remained still. I looked back at him, and this time, he met my eyes. There was something there. Respect, perhaps, or caution. He didn't smile. He didn't push. He waited. The silence stretched long enough for Monica to notice. Her smile faltered just slightly, the way a candle flickers before wind. "Something wrong?" she asked, her voice too bright. I tapped the edge of page 3 gently. "No," I said, my voice quiet. "Just reading." Her shoulders dropped a centimeter. She relaxed too soon. I reread the clause, letting each word settle in my chest like weight being evenly distributed. I imagined the ink drying all over again. My own words, written in legalese. My own signature already there, guarding me like a lockbox only I could open. The pen rested beside my hand, but I didn't reach for it. I leaned back in the chair, let the silence fill the room like a slow fog, and folded my hands in my lap. Caleb closed the folder gently and said he could give us a moment. He stood and walked to the door. I nodded once. Monica sat frozen, her mouth slightly parted, as if she wasn't sure what had just shifted. But I felt it. Somewhere in that stillness, the center of the conversation had moved from her timeline to mine. The voice that had guided me, soft, buried, but clear, had done more than remind me to read. It had reminded me I still had a choice. The folder lay open in front of me like a dissected animal, its insides exposed, nothing left to guess. I could feel the weight of the moment pressing down through the paper, not from the legal language, but from what it implied, what it protected, what it warned against. The bank's fluorescent lighting was too bright above us, casting hard-edged shadows across the table, highlighting every crease in the pages, every wrinkle in my knuckles, every twitch of tension in Monica's jaw. My eyes drifted back to the paragraph. Clause 7-4. I reread it slowly, my fingertip resting just above the bolded line, as if touching it too directly might trigger something. It wasn't long, 4 sentences, no more than a couple dozen words, but it held the shape of something sharp. In the event the grantor believes psychological pressure, manipulation, or coercive behavior influenced the execution of this agreement, the grantor reserves the right to revoke this document in full within 90 calendar days following the signature date, with no further legal recourse or challenge by any party. I had asked for this clause the way you ask for a spare key you hope you never have to use. I remembered the day I insisted on it. It had been quiet in the notary's office, just the hum of her space heater in the corner and the soft tapping of her nails on the keyboard. I had chosen the words carefully. I didn't want drama. I wanted insurance. Not the kind you pay for with monthly premiums, but the kind you buy with awareness, with time, with a gut feeling you stop ignoring. Now, those words were real, inked, filed, witnessed. I felt Monica's gaze on me. Her posture hadn't shifted, but the energy in her body had. She was too still. Stillness like that always meant calculation. I turned the page back to the front and then back again, as if reviewing the document for the first time, though I knew every word. My fingers brushed the edge of the paper, and I noticed the faint imprint of the seal. Embossed, official, irreversible, unless I chose otherwise. This clause was not common. Most property transfers didn't include such language. It had taken a bit of negotiation to insert it quietly. Caleb had known the right people. Discreet, precise. I hadn't told Daniel. I certainly hadn't told Monica. I had hoped I wouldn't need it. But hope was never a plan. Across the table, Monica finally shifted. Her hand, which had been resting on her lap, moved to the arm of the chair, gripping it lightly. Her nails were painted a pale pink, almost white under the bank's lighting. I noticed a small chip on her thumbnail, and I wondered if it had happened today, maybe on the car door handle or while scrolling too fast through her phone. She leaned forward, just slightly. "Is everything as expected?" she asked, her voice still soft, but there was a new tension beneath it, like a wire stretched too far. I looked at her for a full 3 seconds before answering. In those 3 seconds, I saw all the years we'd spent tolerating each other. Her forced politeness, my patient silence. The way she moved through my home like a guest who was already planning renovations. The way she'd boxed up Eleanor's favorite dishes before the first year had even passed. "It's all there," I said. And it was. It was all there. Not just the clause, but everything it symbolized. The acknowledgement of the slow erosion of trust. The readiness to defend what little dignity I still had left. The understanding that if I didn't protect myself now, no one else would. I turned to the signature line again. My name, printed in full, weighted above the empty space. My pen lay beside it, polished, weighty, with a black rubber grip and the bank's logo engraved into the metal. It felt cold, even in the warmth of my hand. I glanced back at clause 7-4 one last time. Monica's breathing had changed. She was still smiling, but her eyes were no longer steady. I saw the shift, the way she suddenly knew she had missed something, the way the balance had changed without her permission. She leaned in, perhaps trying to read the page again, but I shifted my elbow slightly, blocking her view without making it obvious. I wasn't ready to share what I knew, not yet. Let it live there in silence for a while, in the same silence she had used so many times to take without asking. I didn't sign, not yet. Instead, I stood up. "I think I need a moment," I said, though I already knew what my decision would be. Caleb nodded silently, his face unreadable. Monica blinked, surprised, but said nothing. Her hands moved back to her lap, and I could see the tension in her fingers, the way she curled them inward. I stepped out of the conference room and into the hallway, where the carpet was thinner and the lighting warmer. A framed photo of the bank's founding in the 1960s hung crooked on the wall. I adjusted it absently as I passed. The hallway smelled faintly of printer toner and floor wax, the scent of bureaucracy and quiet power. I stood by the water cooler and poured a paper cup halfway. The water was lukewarm. I sipped it anyway, letting it settle in my chest, grounding me. When I returned, I didn't sit. I picked up the folder again, flipped to Clause 7.4, and placed a yellow tab next to it. Monica noticed. She stiffened. Her mouth opened slightly, but no sound came out. I didn't give her a reaction. I tapped the tab once with my fingertip, closed the folder slowly, and looked up at Caleb. "I'll take it home," I said. "I'll sign it after I've read it again." He nodded, offering no resistance. Monica tried to protest, a half-formed sentence about scheduling and deadlines, but I had already turned toward the door. I didn't need to hear her say anything. I had already heard enough. The clause spoke louder than she ever had. That morning, the kitchen was unusually quiet. The birds hadn't yet found their way to the feeder outside the window, and the refrigerator made a low, distant hum, like an old man clearing his throat, but not speaking. I moved slowly through the space, my slippers whispering across the linoleum that Eleanor and I had installed together 40 years ago. Back then, we had argued about the color. She wanted something bright. I preferred something muted. We compromised, as we always did. Gray-blue with a slight speckle, something between ocean and ash. The cupboard still held our old Corelle dishes. Most were chipped or slightly discolored at the edges, the kind of wear that only decades of use could create. But there was one that stood apart, a single white ceramic cup with a hairline crack down one side, barely visible unless the light hit it just right. It had no matching saucer, no set, just the cup. It had been hers. She used to drink her morning tea from it, Earl Grey, always. She claimed the bergamot cleared her mind. I never argued. The scent of it would fill the kitchen, mingling with the smell of toast and lemon-scented dish soap. Even now, if I closed my eyes, I could feel her presence through that combination of smells. I reached for the cup and held it in both hands for a moment, letting its smooth porcelain surface rest against my palms. It was cool to the touch, and the crack along the side gave it texture, like a scar that had healed but never disappeared. I rinsed it under lukewarm water, wiped it with a cotton towel, and placed it on the counter. The kettle, an old stainless steel one with a blackened bottom, took longer to boil these days. I let it rattle on the stove while I leaned against the sink and looked out the window. The garden beyond the glass was still asleep under a layer of frost. The rose bushes had withered to thorny silhouettes, but I knew come April they'd return. Eleanor always said gardens were the only things that forgave you for forgetting them. When the kettle began to whistle, sharp, insistent, I moved automatically. I had done this so many mornings it no longer felt like a conscious act. One bag, one cup, pour just enough, let it steep, no sugar, no milk, just hot, bitter clarity. As I sat down at the kitchen table with the white cup in front of me, I noticed a small stack of unopened mail beside the napkin holder. Catalogs, insurance flyers, a postcard from a funeral home. I moved them aside. My attention was fixed not on the tea, but on the memory of her hands holding the same cup, the way her thumb rested along the crack like she was tracing it absent-mindedly. I hadn't told anyone about Clause 7.4, not Daniel, certainly not Monica. And now that the paper sat folded inside the drawer of the roll-top desk in the study, it felt heavier than any legal document should. I could almost hear it breathing beneath the wood, like something alive waiting to be awakened. The white cup steamed gently. I lifted it to my lips and took the first sip. It tasted slightly off. Maybe the tea bag was old. Or maybe it was just my tongue remembering a taste that no longer existed. I placed the cup down and watched the steam rise and dissolve into the morning light slanting through the blinds. Dust motes danced in the golden beams, silent and stubborn. Across the table sat Eleanor's old sewing basket, still filled with tangled threads, half-used spools, and faded instruction booklets. She had left it there during her last week, unable to finish a hem she had started on one of my shirts. I'd never moved it. The unfinished blue thread still hung from the side, like a sentence interrupted mid-thought. There was something profoundly wrong with the way silence filled this house now. Not peaceful or restful, but suspicious, as if the walls were listening, holding in things they were not meant to keep. The white cup cooled. I opened the drawer beside me and took out the bank folder. I set it on the table beside the cup and slowly opened it to the flagged page. Clause 7-4 stared back at me with its clean, cold detachment. No emotion, no interpretation, just contingency in black ink. The house was quiet. Too quiet. Somewhere down the street, a garbage truck rumbled past. Its brakes hissed. A dog barked once, then stopped. The sounds reached the kitchen as if through water, muffled, distorted, far away. I ran my fingers along the edges of the page. My nails were too long. I hadn't trimmed them in over a week. Eleanor would have noticed. She always kept nail scissors in the medicine cabinet, the kind with the curved blades. I thought about getting them, trimming my nails, doing something normal, but I didn't move. Instead, I folded the folder closed and set it down on top of a cloth placemat that had long since faded from green to gray. I placed the white cup on top of the folder like a quiet sentinel, letting the thin ring of moisture soak slowly into the paper. I didn't care. Let it leave a mark. That mark would mean it had existed, that I had sat there, that I had known. That morning, I didn't go out. I didn't call anyone. I didn't turn on the television. I let the clock tick behind me, the one that Eleanor's father had made by hand, the one with the walnut frame and brass pendulum that moved just slightly off-center. Each tick sounded like a step into deeper thought. Time, I realized, was not linear inside grief. It curved, repeated, echoed. I sat with the cup, the paper, and the past. And I waited, not for a sign, not for a decision, but for the right silence to settle. The kind of silence that doesn't accuse, doesn't lie, doesn't press. The kind that simply holds you, like warm hands around a cracked white cup. And when it came, I knew. Not what to do, not how to do it, but that I would. That was enough. The envelope lay untouched on the dining table for 2 days. It was one of those stiff, heavy stock types with a return address embossed in dark ink, the kind that tries to look important before you even open it. I had received enough of those during my career as a surveyor. Contract agreements, city permits, legal notices. This one came from Daniel and Monica's lawyer. The name on the upper left corner was unfamiliar, but the intent was loud, even through the paper. It arrived without warning. No call, no message, no visit. Just a quiet slap of the mailbox lid and the sound of the envelope sliding in like a blade. The morning I finally opened it, the kitchen was steeped in the familiar rhythm of winter. The old radiator hissed gently in the corner, and the smell of dry heat mixed with the faint scent of dust and metal. I had set the kettle on the stove, more out of routine than need, and watched as the steam traced soft spirals toward the ceiling. The light came in low and yellow through the blinds, casting long stripes across the linoleum and catching the rim of the white cup I had left out from the day before. The tea bag inside had dried to a stiff, curled husk. I didn't bother cleaning it. There was something almost sacred about not disturbing it, like the last breath of a decision already forming. I took the envelope, sliced it open with the thin edge of a butter knife, and let the contents slide out with a dry whisper. 3 pages. Stapled. The top one was a cover letter, sterile and clipped, the language dressed in polite legalese that failed to mask its true shape. They were asking me to expedite the transfer. Daniel's name appeared twice in bold. Monica's once. My name, of course, was printed in full. There was a deadline, 3 weeks from the date on the letter, and a suggestion that any delay would complicate matters of transition. That phrase stuck with me. I sat at the dining table, the paper in front of me, and reached for my glasses. The pair I wore were the same ones Eleanor had picked out with me 10 years ago. Thin wire frames, bronze-colored, slightly bent on the left arm where I had once fallen asleep with them on. The right lens had a scratch across it that caught the light in the mornings, casting a faint, distorted line across whatever I looked at. Through that scratch, I read the words again. It wasn't just the request. It was the assumption behind it, as if my signature was a formality, as if my role had already been decided, reduced to a stamp on paper. But it wasn't the letter that made me stop. It was the moment afterward, the stillness, the knowledge that if I signed, it would be over. Not just the house, but the last say I had in anything that bore my name. The last thread that tied me to the home Eleanor and I had built, room by room, over decades of shared air and arguments and forgiveness. I folded the letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. I left it on the table and turned away. That afternoon, Daniel called. I let it ring. The machine picked up, still Eleanor's voice from years ago, soft and a little too close to the microphone. She had recorded it in one take. I had meant to change it after she passed, but never did. Her voice had become a kind of threshold. To cross it meant the call was real. He didn't leave a message. Instead, I heard the car later. His truck, the same dull gray Ford with the rattling belt that gave it away, before it even rounded the corner. He parked in the driveway, but didn't come to the door right away. I heard the crunch of gravel as he paced, then the click of his key in the lock. He had a key. They both did. He stepped inside with the weight of someone who felt entitled to be there. The draft followed him, sharp with December air and something else. Aftershave, maybe. Or laundry detergent. Something unfamiliar that clung to his coat. I didn't meet him in the hall. I stayed in the den, seated in my old recliner, the one with the cracked leather arm and the groove that had formed in the cushion over years of reading and napping and listening to late-night baseball games. He found me there. I didn't rise. Instead, I let the silence speak. He stood a few feet away, shifting from foot to foot, holding something in his hand, maybe a copy of the same document, maybe a coffee. I didn't care. The only sound was the slow tick of the grandfather clock in the corner, the one Eleanor's uncle had left us in his will. It chimed on the quarter hour, always a bit too early, as if trying to hurry time along. Daniel said something. I didn't respond. He waited. Then he said something else. I still didn't respond. That was the first time I said no, not with words, not directly, but with stillness, with refusal, with the simple act of not agreeing to what was assumed. Eventually, he left. The door closed behind him without a slam, but the click of the latch carried more weight than a shout. After he was gone, I stood and walked back to the kitchen. I poured the cold water from the kettle and filled the cup again, letting the fresh tea bag steep in silence. I held the cup close to my face and breathed in the steam. The bergamot was faint, but it was there. The memory of her. I took the envelope, walked into the study, and slid it into the drawer with the others. Contracts, letters, promises, requests, a paper trail of someone else's agenda. But now there was a line in the sand, a quiet, unmovable line. My tea grew cold as I stood by the window and watched the bare branches shake in the wind. The frost had started to thicken along the edges of the glass. It was going to be a cold night. But I felt something warm settling inside me. The kind of warmth that comes not from heat, but from decision. And that, I knew, was the beginning. The room had no windows. It wasn't the kind of thing I noticed right away. At first, I was distracted by the smell, a synthetic blend of lemon-scented cleaner and stale coffee, undercut with something harder to place, like carpet glue or plastic warm from the sun. But there was no sun in that room. Just overhead, fluorescents humming faintly above a false ceiling, casting a light that made everything look colorless. The air felt thick, like it had been recirculated too many times. There was no breeze, no sound of birds or traffic or distant lawnmowers, just the hush of sealed space, as though the world had been shut out entirely. Daniel had told me it would just be a quick meeting. A courtesy, he called it, but I could already feel the narrowing of the walls. Monica had suggested the place, a private office near their financial planner's building. Clean, discreet, out of the way. When I stepped inside, I realized it wasn't an office so much as a holding chamber, not for people, for signatures. The carpet was dark gray, industrial grade, flat as felt. A water cooler in the corner stood next to a plastic ficus plant, its leaves too perfect, too glossy. The reception area had been empty when I arrived, and the woman who eventually showed me in did so without looking me in the eyes. She wore a headset and smelled faintly of hand lotion and impatience. The room itself was maybe 12 feet by 12. A desk, 2 chairs, a single filing cabinet pushed up against the wall. No pictures, no books, no clock. Nothing to remind you what time it was. That bothered me more than I expected. I had always kept track of time. Not obsessively, just enough to orient myself. My watch was still the same Seiko Eleanor had given me on our 35th anniversary. Its crystal was scratched, and the leather strap had split, so I'd replaced it with a nylon one from a corner drugstore. It kept ticking, though. That day, the second hand moved in a deliberate rhythm, steady as breath. I sat when they asked me to. A man in a navy suit with a name too polished to sound real laid out a folder and began speaking in that lilting cadence attorneys use when they want to sound reasonable. I nodded at first. Let him talk. His voice was smooth, but I wasn't listening to the words. I was watching his hands. Well manicured, no calluses. The type of hands that knew paper more than people. The document was placed before me. Another one. Not the same as before, but a continuation. An addendum, he called it. I noticed Monica's signature already there, in her neat, sharp script that always looked like it had been typed. Daniel's was messier, broader, slanted left. Both names stacked like weight above the empty line, meant for mine. I didn't pick up the pen. Instead, I scanned the paragraphs. The language danced around things. Rights, authorizations, disbursement options, risk assessments. But buried in the middle, like a seed inside a piece of fruit, was a clause that made my stomach tighten. It spoke of temporary oversight and asset stewardship. It was worded like a kindness, a safety net. But what it meant was simple. I was being removed from the decision-making process. Quietly, legally, permanently. The man leaned forward. He thought I was hesitating because I didn't understand. But I understood too well. I let my eyes drift across the surface of the desk. No smudges, no papers other than the one in front of me. A single black pen, too heavy in the hand, like a weapon disguised as a gift. The air conditioning kicked on with a low growl, and I felt it press against the back of my neck. I missed the sound of wind through trees, missed the smell of home, old wood, warm tea, the dust that gathered in corners no matter how often you cleaned. My back ached from the chair. It was molded plastic, the kind that pretended to be ergonomic but just made your spine remember its age. I shifted slightly, just to reclaim the sense that I still had control over something. The man began to repeat himself. I looked at the door. There was no window in it either, just a brushed steel handle and a keyhole beneath it. I wondered when it had last been locked. Probably never, but it still felt like a barrier. I felt sealed in, like an item in storage. I reached into my coat pocket and touched the small coin I kept there. A silver $50 from 1963, tarnished along the edges. My father had given it to me when I was a boy. I'd carried it through every move, every war, every funeral. It wasn't worth anything in money, but it reminded me who I had once been. I closed my fingers around it. The man handed me the pen, and I said no, not out loud, just with the slow, deliberate movement of pushing the document back across the table. His hands paused mid-air, confused by the refusal. That small gesture broke the rhythm of the room. The air changed. The silence grew heavier. He asked if I wanted more time. I stood instead. I didn't wait for permission. I didn't look back. In the hallway, I passed the plastic ficus again. Its leaves looked even more absurd now, reflecting the cold light like polished wax. Outside, the winter sun had sunk behind a low wall of clouds, and the pavement shimmered with a faint film of moisture. I walked slowly, letting the cold bite at my face, grateful for its sharpness. When I got to the car, I sat for a long time before turning the key. The dashboard clock blinked 2:46 p.m. I hadn't been in there more than 30 minutes, but it felt like I had lost an hour, or reclaimed one. On the seat beside me, I placed the silver coin and the Seiko watch side by side, two things that still belonged only to me. Then I drove away from the windowless room, the soft ticking of the watch the only sound as I turned toward home. The cup slipped from my hand before I even realized I had picked it up. It shattered against the floor tiles in 5 clean pieces, the handle flying off to the side like a broken limb. The tea spread slowly, a dark amber stain blooming into the grout. The sound it made wasn't loud, but in the silence of the kitchen, it felt like a scream. I stood there motionless, my hand still slightly curled, as if it hadn't yet received the message that the cup was gone. The white porcelain shards glinted up at me like teeth. I hadn't meant to drop it. I hadn't meant to pick it up either. I was just walking past the counter, thinking about what I had overheard the day before, about the lawyer's message still sitting unread on my phone, about the way Monica had brushed past me in the hallway, her perfume too sweet, her smile too smooth. And somehow, my hand had reached for the cup without my permission. It was one of the old ones, from Eleanor's set, bone china, gold-rimmed, almost too delicate to be practical. She had kept them boxed for years, saying they were for guests, though I could never recall anyone special enough to warrant their use. After she passed, I began drinking from them every day. It felt like a small defiance against the shrinking world around me, a ritual I could still choose. Now, one less remained. I knelt to pick up the pieces, careful not to cut myself. The ceramic edges were smoother than I expected. I placed them on a paper towel and folded it over twice before setting it gently in the trash. Not because it mattered, but because she would have done it that way. The tea left a ring on the floor. I got the sponge from under the sink, ran cold water over it, and began scrubbing. The grout held tight to the stain, like memory clinging to the seams of time. I scrubbed harder, then stopped myself. I was shaking. Not from anger, from something quieter, something hollow. I sat down at the kitchen table. The chair groaned under my weight, an old friend complaining but bearing it anyway. The table still had a small divot where Eleanor had once dropped a hot iron by mistake. She used to mend our clothes here, patching elbows and hems while listening to the radio. I ran my thumb across the burn mark, tracing its shape. It looked like a comet. Outside, the sky was pale and uncertain. Winter hadn't arrived, but autumn had run out of gold. The trees were gray bones, shivering against the wind. I could hear the leaves scratching against the siding, whispering things I couldn't quite make out. The sound reminded me of someone trying to apologize through a closed door. I reached for the envelope again. It had been sitting on the table for 3 days, unopened. A thick cream-colored thing with embossed lettering and a gold seal. Monica had handed it to me casually, saying it was from their attorney. Just a follow-up. Her voice had been cheerful, but too fast. The way someone speaks when they're hoping the sentence will run faster than the truth. I had turned it over in my hands many times. The paper was too stiff, expensive, meant to impress or intimidate. It smelled faintly of toner and the citrus-scented polish Monica used on the foyer table. She had always liked things to shine. I broke the seal. The first page was polite, language dressed in silk. "For your review," it began. "Per recent discussions," it continued, "in alignment with agreed-upon estate transitions." But then came the words that cut like glass: cold, clean, irrevocable. It was a revocation. Power of attorney, healthcare proxy, co-signature on the property trust, all rescinded. Not by court order, not even with malice, just a quiet retraction, like crossing out a name with a fine pen. I felt my chest tighten. It wasn't about the documents. Not really. It was the way they did it. No discussion, no explanation. Just a formal notice, dressed in courtesy. Words written in ink so smooth they might as well have been spoken behind a closed door. Words that could be printed 1,000 times and never smudge. Words that didn't ask, didn't warn, didn't wait. Glass words. I thought about the kitchen drawer, the one with Eleanor's old recipe cards, handwritten, some with smudges of flour still clinging to the corners. She had always refused to type them out, said the mess was part of the memory. I opened it now and ran my hand along the edges. The scent of paper and vanilla rose faintly. There was comfort there, in those crooked lines and coffee stains. I pulled out the card for her apple crisp. She had written, "Best served warm, with quiet." I had never noticed that line before. I left the envelope on the counter and went to the pantry. The apples I had picked up from the market were still fresh, their skins tight and cool. I peeled them slowly, the rhythm of the knife steadying my breath. Sugar, cinnamon, a squeeze of lemon. I measured everything by memory. As the oven preheated, the air began to change. The chill of the room gave way to something softer. The scent of baking apples and butter seeped into the walls. It smelled like memory, like defiance, like home. When it was done, I set the dish on the table and poured myself a small glass of milk. Not tea. Not today. The clock on the wall ticked 4:17. The second hand moved like it had somewhere to be. I let the warmth from the dessert rise into my face and closed my eyes. The papers were still there. But so was I. I had not raised my voice. I had not protested. But something inside me had shifted. Not anger, not sadness, just clarity. The kind that comes after something breaks, and you realize what still holds. I would not forget the words, but I would not eat them either. I started writing on the back of an old envelope, not out of laziness, but because it felt appropriate. The paper had already served a purpose. It had carried bills once, maybe a tax notice or a forgotten birthday card. Now it was stripped of its original intent, just like me. I found a pen that still worked and sat at the desk in the guest room, the one no guest had stayed in since Eleanor passed. The desk lamp flickered slightly when I turned it on. Its beige shade had a faint brown line around the top, the result of years of dust and the heat of the bulb. I didn't wipe it off. There were more important things to do. The room smelled of closed windows. Not musty, just stale, like air that had been waiting for someone to need it again. A faint scent of lavender lingered on the curtains. Eleanor used to spritz them with linen spray after every wash. The habit stayed with the fabric long after her hands had left. The pen scratched against the envelope. I wasn't sure what I was writing yet. I started with their names, Monica first, then Daniel. I didn't know why I reversed the order. Maybe because lately, that's how it felt. Her voice louder than his, her will sharper, his eyes duller. I didn't accuse them. I didn't beg. I wrote facts, dates, figures, the year I bought the house, the repairs I paid for, the time I canceled the trip to visit my brother in Oregon because Daniel needed a co-signer on a car loan, the thousands of dollars I had handed over across the years, always saying, "It's for the kids," even though the kids rarely called. The page filled quickly. I tore it from the envelope and grabbed a fresh notepad, one of those cheap ones from the pharmacy. The paper was thin, and the cardboard backing was already curling at the edges, but the pages held ink, and that was enough. I wrote for 3 hours, not straight through. I paused to stretch my fingers, to pour myself water, to stare out the window as squirrels performed their frantic little dances along the fence line. But I kept coming back to the chair, to the page, to the ache in my spine, and the slow determination in my wrist. I didn't write to wound them. I wrote to remove the silence they had left in their wake. I included the numbers. The bank account I had closed 6 months ago, the one they didn't know had ever existed. The savings bonds Eleanor and I had kept in a fireproof box, now gone to the foundation that built benches in veteran cemeteries. I detailed the small trust I had redirected to the community college under my name, a scholarship for older adults who wanted to learn again. I wrote the clause number, the one Monica had overlooked, the one the banker had whispered about. Clause 7.4. In the absence of mutual consent from all original grantors, no legal reassignment shall take effect without signed acknowledgement from the senior co-grantor, herein referred to as the primary holder. That was me. I pressed my thumb against the page after I wrote that sentence. My print left a faint smudge in the lower margin. Proof of presence. Proof of intent. I didn't print the letter. I didn't type it. I knew they'd mock the handwriting, say it was shaky, hard to read, disorganized. But my words weren't meant for their comfort. They were meant to live on paper like seeds in dry soil, waiting for a storm. I folded the pages slowly, one by one, aligning the edges until they were sharp. I slid them into a plain manila envelope. No return address. I used Eleanor's old floral stamps. She had collected them for years, but never mailed anything. Said they were too pretty to give away. As I sealed the envelope, I caught sight of myself in the hallway mirror. I looked older than I remembered. My face was no longer symmetrical. One eye drooped slightly, the result of an old nerve issue. My shoulders hunched, not out of fear, but from time. Still, there was something in my posture that surprised me. Not pride, exactly. Not defiance. Just presence. I didn't drive to the post office right away. I made myself a sandwich first. Just white bread, turkey, a slice of tomato, and a smear of mustard. It tasted dry, but it grounded me. I ate it at the kitchen table, the place where Eleanor used to correct the crossword in pen, even when she wasn't sure of the answers. The television played softly in the background, one of those daytime court shows where people shout about fences and borrowed jewelry. I watched without hearing. The images passed in front of me like strangers on a train. I didn't need distraction. I just needed motion around me. Proof that the world continued, even when people forget how to see you. At 3:12 p.m., I drove to the post office. The parking lot was half empty, as it always was. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed like flies trapped between glass. A young man at the counter smiled without commitment. I handed over the envelope and asked for tracking, just in case. The receipt crinkled in my wallet. I tucked it behind a photo of Eleanor from 1972, the one where she stood in front of the lilac bush, squinting into the sun. I had kept that picture for decades. It had survived moves, a house fire, and 2 bouts of pneumonia. Now it lived in the worn folds of leather, next to my license, and a dog-eared business card from a mechanic who had retired 5 years ago. That evening, I slept without setting an alarm. I didn't dream of confrontation. I didn't imagine their faces. I simply dreamed of paper, a single sheet, drifting down onto a still lake, sending out ripples wider than the eye could measure. The lake was quiet, but the paper floated with purpose, refusing to sink. When I woke, the sun had already broken past the blinds. A beam of light fell across the foot of my bed, warm and golden. Dust floated through it like tiny messengers. I stared at it for a long time. The reply had been sent, not with bitterness, not with fire, but with ink, and weight, and signature. It began with a creak on the front steps, a sound so small, so unremarkable that it might have gone unnoticed if the house hadn't been so quiet. I had just finished sweeping the kitchen floor, a habit I kept even though the place hardly gathered dust anymore. I had rinsed out the mop and hung it upside down on the porch rail to dry. The sunlight was falling low by then, spreading long shadows across the wood grain, and the air carried that subtle chill that always came just before fall, truly took hold. It was the kind of evening where you start thinking about lighting the pilot on the old furnace again, but don't quite bring yourself to do it yet. I stood still by the screen door. There it was again, that soft groan of weight shifting on old wood, the sound of someone hesitating, someone deciding whether to knock, to speak, or to turn away. Through the thin mesh of the screen, I saw her silhouette before I saw her face. Monica. Her shoulders were hunched in a way that made her look smaller than I remembered. Her hair was tied back, but not neatly, not with her usual sharpness. She wore a pale jacket and carried a purse tucked tightly under one arm like a shield. She hadn't rung the doorbell. I hadn't heard a car. Maybe she'd parked down the block. Maybe she didn't want anyone to know she had come. I didn't open the door right away. I let the silence stretch. I wanted to see what she would do when she thought no one was watching. Her fingers twitched near the hem of her sleeve. She looked at the doormat, then at the corner of the porch, where a chipped clay pot sat empty since the spring. She used to hate that pot, said it made the house look abandoned. Still, she didn't knock. Instead, she stepped back, just once. One backward movement, slow and unsure, like a chess piece reconsidering its path. Her eyes darted left, then right, then up, toward the window above the porch, where the curtain moved just slightly in the breeze. I knew she saw me then, or guessed I was there. I opened the door. The air shifted between us. She didn't step closer, and I didn't invite her in. We stood there, separated by a fine screen and years of things left unsaid. She finally spoke, but I couldn't hear the words. Her lips moved, but the mesh swallowed the sound. I didn't ask her to repeat it. Instead, I pushed the door open and stepped outside. The porch boards were cold under my slippers. I hadn't changed out of them since lunch. They were frayed at the heels, and the left one was starting to split along the seam. Eleanor used to sew them back up, one small stitch at a time. I never learned how. I sat down in the old chair by the window, the one with the green cushion that had faded into a sort of gray over the years. The stuffing inside had shifted unevenly, but it still held my weight. The porch had always been my place to think, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me, not even her. Monica didn't sit. She stayed standing, arms crossed now, as if to keep the wind from cutting through her too sharply. But it wasn't the wind that chilled her. I knew that much. Guilt had its own temperature. She began to speak again, slower this time. I could hear her voice, but not the meaning. Not yet. It came in fragments. We didn't know. The lawyer? Just a misunderstanding. Words that tried to wrap themselves in reason, but never quite reached the bone. I looked at the porch railing. A small spider was building a web between the post and the hanging fern. It moved with such quiet focus, looping and anchoring, as if no one could interrupt its work. I admired that. Monica shifted her weight from one foot to the other. Her shoes were clean, expensive, but the way she stood made them look too tight. She had brought something in her purse. I could tell by the way she kept touching the clasp, the way her thumb hovered like she might pull it open and reveal whatever token she thought would make this easier. But she didn't. Instead, she said my name. Just once. Like she was testing if I'd answer to it again. If I was still the man she remembered, or if I had become something else, something unreachable. I didn't respond. I looked past her, toward the sidewalk. A group of boys rode by on bicycles, laughing about something none of us could understand anymore. Their tires crackled over the dry leaves, and for a moment it sounded like rain. That fleeting, soft-spoken kind of rain that vanishes before you realize it ever fell. Monica stepped closer, just half a pace. Her hand brushed the top of the railing, near the spot where Eleanor once planted petunias in small hanging pots. The hooks were still there, rusted now, empty. She stared at them for a moment, then pulled her hand back, as if the metal might burn her. She said she was sorry. That word, small and brittle, fell between us and cracked on the wood like glass. Not because it was untrue. Maybe she meant it. Maybe part of her did. But it came too late, and it came without weight. A word like that needs to be carried in the hands, not dropped from the mouth. I stood up slowly. My knees popped the way they always did when I moved too fast, but I didn't wince. I just placed a hand on the frame of the door and nodded toward the edge of the porch. The meaning was clear. She nodded too, this time not with resistance, but with resignation. She turned, walked down the steps, and disappeared down the sidewalk without looking back. The spider was still building. The light had shifted again, and the threads shimmered silver in the dusk. I watched them catch the fading sun, one loop at a time, fragile and precise. The porch creaked again, but it was just me shifting in the chair. I leaned back, exhaled through my nose, and closed my eyes for a while. The shadow was gone, but it had left its shape. The radio sat on the windowsill, exactly where Eleanor had left it 23 years ago, beside the faded jar of buttons and the chipped ceramic ashtray that still smelled faintly of lavender and tobacco. It hadn't played in over a decade, at least not properly. The volume knob was sticky, the dial never quite aligned with the station markings, and the antenna was broken clean off, replaced long ago with a bent coat hanger that poked out at an awkward angle, like the crooked finger of a stubborn old man. But that morning, I turned it on anyway. There was a ritual to it. I had to press the power button just hard enough to hear the faint click, then wait as the machine hummed itself awake. The speaker crackled softly, like fire in a cold fireplace, and for a moment I thought that might be all I'd get. But then, as if summoned from some dusty memory hidden between frequencies, the music emerged, low and warbled, distorted at first, but then clearer, until the voice of a man I didn't know filled the room, singing a song I had once danced to in a different life. I let it play. I didn't try to find a better station. I didn't fuss with the dial. I just let the music drift through the house like smoke, curling around the corners, slipping under doors, wrapping itself around the banister, and settling in the cracks of the kitchen tiles. The song was slow, some old jazz standard from before my time, but the rhythm was familiar in a way only old things can be. I poured my coffee, black, no sugar, the way Eleanor used to drink it. I never liked it that way, but I kept doing it out of habit. Some part of me still believed if I drank it long enough, she might walk into the room and take it from my hand like she used to, muttering that I'd never get used to it. The mug was chipped. It had a faded image of the Grand Canyon on it, a souvenir from a trip we never took. Her sister brought it back and gave it to us like a consolation prize. The radio played on, I sat at the kitchen table, the one with the deep scratch in the wood from when I tried to assemble Ethan's toy train, set one Christmas without instructions. He was 7, or maybe 6. I remembered the way his face lit up when it finally worked, when the little engine clicked into motion and started circling the tree. He used to sit on this very floor, right where the linoleum now peeled in the corner, watching it go round and round with his mouth slightly open. The song ended. Static returned. The announcer's voice followed, calm and warm, talking about traffic delays and weather patterns. None of it mattered to me. I hadn't driven in months. My world had shrunk to the size of this house, this kitchen, this chair. But the voice filled the silence, and I was grateful. I opened the drawer beside me. Inside were receipts, rubber bands, a broken tape measure, a pack of expired batteries, and a small red notebook. I pulled the notebook out. Its spine was bent, the pages curled from years of moisture and thumbprints. It was Eleanor's. She used it to write grocery lists and little notes to herself. Odd phrases like, "Check the bird bath," or "Call Ruth, Thursday 9 a.m., scribbled in blue ink. Her handwriting had started to slope downward in the final years. The last page simply read, "Wait." That was it. Just the one word. I closed the book gently, as though it might shatter. The radio shifted again. A new song began. This one was orchestral, no vocals, just soft strings and a piano that sounded like it had been recorded underwater. I stood and walked toward the living room. The floorboards creaked with each step, like they remembered the weight of old arguments and quiet reconciliations. I passed the coat rack, where my jacket still hung from last winter. It smelled of dust and the peppermint candies I kept in the pocket for no good reason. I sat in the armchair facing the window. Outside, the leaves were beginning to fall in earnest, swirling gently in the breeze, collecting at the edges of the sidewalk. A squirrel darted across the yard, carrying something in its mouth. Probably a piece of my forgotten sandwich from yesterday's lunch on the porch. I didn't mind. I admired its determination. The old radio continued to hum. Its sound filled the space in a way voices no longer did. It didn't ask questions. It didn't interrupt. It didn't forget. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I opened my eyes, the room had darkened, and the light through the window had turned a dusky gold. The music was still playing, but now it was softer, as though the radio itself had grown tired. I rose slowly, joints stiff, and shuffled into the hallway. I paused by the closet and opened the door. Inside were rows of boxes, most unmarked. I pulled out the one labeled 1978. I didn't know why. Maybe the music had stirred something. I brought it back to the table and opened it. Photographs. Dozens of them. Black and white. Polaroids. Faded color prints. There was one of Eleanor holding Ethan in the hospital, her eyes red but smiling. One of me, much younger, standing on the roof with a wrench in one hand and grease on my face. One of the three of us, taken by a neighbor on Easter Sunday, all dressed in clothes we'd borrowed for the occasion. I picked up a photo of Ethan at age 12, sitting on the porch steps, holding the family dog. He looked like a stranger to me now. That boy no longer existed, and maybe I didn't either. The radio began to crackle again. I looked over at it, wondering if it would finally give out. But instead, a voice came through, older, slower, announcing the hour. I glanced at the clock. It was wrong, as always, 5 minutes behind. The second hand was stuck, twitching in place like it couldn't decide to move forward or give up. I sat with the photographs for a long time, letting the music play, letting the light dim. I didn't reach for the lamp. I let the darkness come in slow, like fog creeping under the door. Somewhere in that space between the last song and the next, I felt something shift. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a quiet rearrangement of thoughts, like furniture in the attic being moved ever so slightly. The radio, that stubborn old relic, still had more to say. So, I let it speak. The pen sat beside the envelope all morning. I had placed it there deliberately on the oak table near the window, where the light hit just right around 10 o'clock. The envelope was cream-colored, the good kind, the kind Eleanor used to buy in bulk from that little stationery shop with the brass bell over the door. It still smelled faintly of the drawer I'd kept it in: cedar, old rubber bands, and something medicinal I couldn't quite name. The flap was unsealed. Inside were 5 pages and the weight of 27 years. I hadn't signed yet. I'd written the letter the week before, sitting at the same table with my old reading glasses slipping down my nose and the draft creeping in through the window frame, no matter how tightly I stuffed the towel underneath it. It took 3 days to write, but when I read it back, it felt like I'd been composing it in my mind for decades. The words didn't come easily. I wasn't a man of letters. I didn't know how to say sorry without making it sound like an excuse, or how to remember without slipping into shame. But I tried. That morning, I woke up earlier than usual. The house was still. Even the birds outside had stayed quiet, as if the trees were holding their breath with me. I put the kettle on, the same one with the melted black handle that hissed when it boiled. I didn't mind the hiss. It reminded me that things still functioned even after damage. I spooned instant coffee into my chipped mug and filled it with the hot water. No milk, no sugar, just the sharp bitterness and the warmth in my palms. The radio was silent that morning. I didn't turn it on. I needed silence, needed to hear my own thoughts without them being drowned out by static or saxophones. I sat at the table, the mug warming the dry skin of my hands, and stared at the envelope. My name was typed in the top corner of the first page, the date just below it. My handwriting was still sharp, but more fragile now, the kind that trembled at the ends of letters like the hand wasn't entirely convinced of what it was saying. I kept thinking about the signature. Just a few strokes of ink, a flourish, a name. But more than that, it would be a final act, a closing, a turning of a key. In the kitchen drawer, among the manuals for appliances I no longer owned, I found the black pen I'd been saving. It was a gift, long ago, from an old friend whose face I couldn't clearly recall anymore. The pen still worked, the ink steady, the weight familiar in my hand. I rolled it between my fingers, testing its balance. I opened the envelope again, unfolded the pages, and read them one more time. There were no grand revelations inside, no confessions that would change the course of anyone's life. It was just truth. Slow, careful truth. I wrote about the silence that had grown between me and Ethan, about how silence can start as protection and end as punishment, about how I never meant to become a ghost in his life, about the day I saw him through the cafe window with his daughter and didn't go in, about the way I stood there, coat buttoned to my throat, watching him laugh at something she said, and realizing that I didn't know what his laugh sounded like anymore. I wrote about the box in the attic, the one filled with old birthday cards and Father's Day drawings. I wrote about the hammer I used to fix his crib and how I still kept it in the shed, even though the handle had splintered. I wrote about the room that was once his, now empty except for a deflated basketball and a shelf of dusty trophies. I didn't ask for anything. I didn't demand understanding. I just wanted to tell the truth in my own words, before time decided I couldn't. The morning drifted on. I sipped my coffee, now lukewarm and bitter. Outside, the mail truck passed, tires crunching against the gravel, the driver waving instinctively, even though I never waved back. It had become a ritual between us, a silent exchange of acknowledgement without commitment. I wiped the edge of the table with the sleeve of my sweater, as if cleaning the surface would somehow prepare me better for the act ahead. The pen was still in my hand. My fingers ached slightly. The tremor that had started last winter was worse in the mornings. I placed the first page flat against the table, smoothed it with my palm, and picked up the pen. I paused. Somewhere in the house, the old wall clock chimed once, a half-hour past 10. Its tone was dull, as though the bell inside had cracked years ago and no one had bothered to fix it. That chime brought a memory, sudden and sharp. Eleanor standing at this same table, holding a peach in one hand and a letter in the other. She looked up at me and smiled like she already knew the contents. That peach had dripped down her wrist, staining the envelope she never opened. I don't remember what it was about, but I remember the stain. My hand hovered over the page. I placed the pen down once more and stood. I walked to the sink and rinsed my cup. The hot water steamed against the cold porcelain, and the smell of coffee rose again. Earthy, burnt, familiar. I dried the mug with the towel that hung by the fridge and placed it upside down in the drying rack. I opened the back door and let in a breath of air. The wind had picked up. Leaves tumbled across the yard, and a neighbor's wind chime rang in uneven tones. I closed the door and returned to the table. This time, I didn't pause. I signed. The ink bled slightly into the page, just a little. Not enough to smudge, but enough to show its age. The loop on the R wasn't as clean as I remembered it being in younger years. My name looked smaller somehow, even though I'd written it the same way for 75 years. I capped the pen and placed it beside the envelope. I let my hand rest on the papers for a moment, not pressing down, just touching. The act was done. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. I folded the letter back into the envelope, sealed the flap, and wrote the address. I didn't need to look it up. It had been burned into my memory the way regrets always are. I placed a stamp in the top corner, the kind with a little American flag that looked like it was rippling in the wind. I pressed it down firmly. The mailbox was at the end of the drive, beneath the crabapple tree that hadn't bloomed properly in 3 years. I walked slowly, feeling the familiar ache in my hip, hearing the crunch of leaves under my slippers. I opened the lid, placed the envelope inside, and closed it with a soft click. Back inside, the table was empty except for the pen and the faint ring of my coffee cup. I didn't wipe it away. I left it there, a small circular echo of something that had already passed. I found the notebook again on a Thursday morning, tucked behind a pile of winter scarves in the closet I rarely opened. The air inside was stale, dense with the scent of old cedar and faint perfume. Eleanor's favorite, the one with the blue label and the cracked cap. The closet had become a mausoleum of fabric and memory. I had opened it to look for nothing in particular, only because I couldn't bear the quiet of the kitchen that day. But there it was, spine bent, the corners frayed, the elastic band long since snapped. The notebook I had started 2 decades earlier. I brought it to the table without brushing off the dust. It was the kind I always preferred. A5, soft cover, yellowish pages that didn't glare in the light. Inside, the ink had faded to a watery gray. My handwriting had changed since the first entries. Back then, it had weight and balance, neat loops and slanted lines. Later, the strokes became less certain, like each letter had to be coaxed into place. I flipped through it slowly, the way one turns a photo album when no one is watching. I saw old lists, drafts of letters never sent, observations scribbled from park benches, snippets of overheard conversations, recipes for soups I forgot how to make. And between those things, fragments of a life that had long since become quiet. A dried leaf fell from one of the middle pages. A real one. Maple, I think. Pressed flat, veins still visible, brown curling at the edges. I didn't remember placing it there, but it didn't surprise me either. That was the year I used to walk through the cemetery each morning, collecting whatever the trees let fall. I told myself it was about exercise, but really it was about names on stones, dates that made me pause, and the silence between the crows. I left the leaf on the table beside the mug of tea I hadn't touched. It had gone cold, the way tea always does when you pretend to be busy with something else. Toward the back of the notebook, there were blank pages, 3 or 4. I ran my hand over the last used one. It had a poem, half finished, written in the margin. I couldn't tell if it was meant to be about Eleanor or someone else, or no one. It ended mid-line, as if I had been called away and never returned. The ink was heavier there, like I had pressed harder, maybe out of frustration, or loneliness. I turned to the final blank page and stared at it. Something about that emptiness felt different, not like possibility, not anymore. More like a soft boundary, the kind you feel when your fingers meet the bottom of a drawer you thought had no end. I fetched a pen from the drawer by the sink, the same pen I'd used for my taxes, my lists, my letters to Ethan that I never mailed. It was blue now, not black, but I didn't mind. The weight was what mattered. My hands remembered how to hold it. I didn't know what I meant to write. I just knew it had to be the last thing. I began with the date, in the top right corner. The numbers felt like strangers. September had arrived, though I hadn't noticed the shift in air. I wrote the name of the town, Stillwater, still as ever. Then I waited. The page offered no resistance. It never did. I wrote slowly. No flourishes, no poetry, just a record. I wrote about the weather, about the way the light came through the curtains at that hour, making the dust look like it was dancing. I described the ticking of the kitchen clock, the one Eleanor had chosen in a thrift shop because it reminded her of her childhood home. I wrote about the way the house had grown quieter, not suddenly but over time, the way a tree sheds its leaves one by one. I wrote about the morning I found Ethan's letter in the mailbox, 10 years after the silence had begun. I hadn't known what to do with it. I hadn't opened it for weeks, just left it in the drawer beside the silverware, between the old coupons and a birthday card with no signature. When I finally read it, I only cried for a minute. Then I made toast. That part seemed important to include. The pen scratched lightly, making its own music. I paused once to sip my tea, forgetting again that it was cold. I didn't mind. The bitterness grounded me. I wrote about my hands, how they used to be strong, how they fixed fence posts and planted tulips and built bookshelves, how now they trembled when buttoning shirts or slicing apples. I wrote about the shirts themselves, lined in the closet, all shades of blue, because I no longer had the energy to choose anything else. I described the scent of the linen drawer, talcum, wood polish, something faintly like lemon. I described the hum of the refrigerator, constant like a background thought you never quite finish. I wrote about Eleanor, about the way she always turned her pillow twice before going to sleep, about how she lined the trash bin with 2 plastic bags, just in case. About the time she laughed so hard at a joke in a magazine she cried, and I had to read it aloud to understand what was so funny. I couldn't remember the punchline, just her laugh. And finally, I wrote about the day she died. Not the hospital or the machines or the paperwork, just the weather, just how it had rained at dawn, and then stopped, and how the sun came in like it was sorry. How I had made oatmeal that morning but forgot to eat it. How I left the spoon in the bowl, and when I came back hours later, it had turned to paste. I left it there another day before washing it. The page was almost full now. I ended with a sentence I didn't expect. I wrote, "I am still here, even if no one is watching." I didn't plan it, but when I finished writing it, I placed the pen down and didn't pick it up again. I didn't tear the page. I didn't sign it. I closed the notebook and sat still. The light had shifted. Longer now, softer. I looked at the leaf beside my mug and wondered how many years it had been pressed there. I lifted it gently and placed it between the final 2 pages. It crinkled softly as it went in. Outside, the wind moved through the maple like it had something to say. The shadows on the kitchen wall grew taller. I let the silence settle around me. Not heavy, not empty, just present. I stood, placed the notebook in the drawer where I kept the tools I no longer used, and closed it with care. I didn't need to read what I had written. I already knew it by heart. The morning began like any other, slow, muffled, draped in that amber silence only known to those who have outlived their expectations. The house felt still, as if it were holding its breath, waiting for something that wouldn't come. I shuffled across the kitchen floor in wool socks, the soles thinning, the pattern of little pine cones nearly worn away. The tiles beneath were cold, even in September. I didn't turn on the lights. I liked the half-light best, when the world hadn't yet declared itself. The kettle took longer than usual. I leaned on the counter, palms flat, feeling the cool laminate against my skin. The whistle came in a weak sputter instead of a shrill cry. I poured the water into my white mug, the one with the faded gold rim, and let the tea bag dance for a moment before settling into stillness. It was always the same brand, the same flavor. Earl Grey, loose leaf, stored in an old jam jar labeled in Eleanor's handwriting. Even now, I took the jar out slowly, as if the label might crumble if I moved too fast. I carried the mug to the window and sat at the table, the same spot I had sat for the last 20 years. The chair creaked familiarly under my weight. Outside, the trees had begun their quiet shedding. A few leaves clung stubbornly to the branches, yellow and gold, like aging hands refusing to let go. The porch railing was chipped, the paint blistering in places. I made a mental note to sand it, though I knew I wouldn't. On the table lay the envelope, cream-colored, thicker than standard. I had taken it from the mailbox 2 days ago and hadn't opened it, not out of fear, but out of a strange reverence. Its return address was from the firm in town, the one my son had been so certain would take care of everything. I ran my thumb across the seal. The glue crackled slightly, and I peeled it open with the same care one might give a letter from the dead. Inside, the paperwork was neatly arranged. Legal language, impersonal fonts, lines for initials and signatures. I turned to the last page and saw what I needed, the confirmation that the property transfer had gone through. The deed was no longer under the family trust. It was mine again, just my name. Not Ethan's, not Caroline's, just mine. I exhaled so softly I barely heard it. Beside the deed was a letter from the attorney, short, formal. He congratulated me on the successful transaction. He didn't know the story behind it, of course. He didn't know the years I had lived in this house while my name slowly disappeared from the documents, as if I were becoming a guest in my own life. He didn't know how many times I had been asked if I still needed so much space. He didn't know that Ethan once suggested selling the house for a condo with better lighting and safety features, as if aging were a crime to be managed, not a life to be respected. I folded the papers slowly and slid them back into the envelope. I placed it in the drawer beneath the toaster, next to the spare batteries, old instruction manuals, and the scissors that no longer cut clean. I closed the drawer with the same quiet finality I had used when I buried Eleanor's favorite necklace in the garden. That was the summer after she died. I hadn't told anyone. I didn't want it to be worn by strangers or passed around like some family relic. It belonged to the earth now, among the roots and stones and worms. The clock on the wall ticked its dry wooden rhythm. It had belonged to my father. Every Sunday, I wound it the same way he once did. 3 slow turns of the key, a pause, a fourth for good luck. It had stopped once, years ago, when the house was full of arguing voices and the air smelled like burned garlic. I remembered standing on a ladder to reset the pendulum, hands shaking. Since then, it never failed. At noon, I opened the back door and stepped onto the porch. The wind moved through the trees in a way that reminded me of applause heard from a distant theater. Soft, layered, anonymous. I carried the radio outside. The old one. Wooden casing, knobs slightly cracked. Eleanor used to play it on weekend mornings while she baked. I hadn't turned it on in months. The dial was stuck slightly between stations, but I found one that played violins. They filled the air like silk unraveling. I sat in the rocking chair. It creaked like my knees. The cushion had flattened over the years, but still smelled faintly of rosemary and old linen. I watched as a squirrel darted along the fence, tail twitching with urgency only animals truly understand. I sipped the cooled tea. The bitterness was mild. The aftertaste lingered. I thought about Ethan, about how he would react when he realized the house was no longer his to sell. He would call, of course. There might be shouting, accusations, shock. I imagined the silence that would follow when he realized the truth wasn't negotiable. I had rewritten the story while he wasn't looking, but I didn't feel triumphant. That's not what this was. It wasn't revenge. It was restoration. A quiet reclaiming of space, of dignity, of something no legal document could define. I didn't need to tell him. The paperwork would do that for me. The sky darkened slightly, as if the sun too was tired of performance. I leaned back and listened to the violins. They rose and fell like breathing. I thought about the ink on the paper, the weight of my name standing alone. I thought about the door I would soon repaint, the box of Eleanor's recipes I would bring down from the attic, the cushion I would sew a new cover for, not because anyone would see it, but because it deserved better than faded flowers. The victory wasn't loud. It didn't involve slamming doors or courtroom speeches. It was this: a house filled with silence I chose, a key that turned without resistance, a drawer that held what I wanted, not what they left behind, and a name, mine, carved quietly back into the foundation of a life I refused to surrender. That afternoon, as the sky bruised into dusk, I lit the old oil lamp on the table. The glass chimney was slightly cloudy, but it cast a warm, flickering light. Shadows danced across the wallpaper. I ran my hand along the edge of the table, smooth from years of meals and elbows and stories. I breathed in the familiar scent of old wood and brewing tea, and for the first time in years, I felt no need to explain anything to anyone. The house was mine again. My silence was not emptiness. It was space reclaimed. That was enough. That was the victory.